For the first few hours, James kept to himself. He mopped the floors, emptied trash bins, and scrubbed windows while the employees carried on with their work, oblivious to his presence. It was a typical Monday morning at Greenstone Enterprises, the kind of corporate giant that dominated headlines, boasted of its global influence, and strutted with a sense of undeniable power. But today was different. The staff arrived at their usual time, bustling through the marble hallways and gathering around their desks, unaware that someone new had slipped in unnoticed. A man dressed in a worn-out jumpsuit, carrying a mop and bucket, moved with quiet precision. His eyes scanned every corner of the building, watching, studying, and noting down every detail. What the employees didn't know was that this seemingly unimportant janitor wasn't just anyone. He was the new owner of the company. But no one knew that. Not yet. James Carter, a man in his early 50s, had recently made headlines, purchasing Greenstone Enterprises for a sum that staggered even the most seasoned investors. But James wasn't like other billionaires. He didn't parade around his wealth or flaunt his power. No. Instead of showing up as the new CEO, taking his place at the head of the boardroom table, he chose to slip in unnoticed as a cleaner. Why would a man worth billions choose to become a mere janitor? The answer wasn't so simple. Was it about humility? A test of loyalty? Or was it something darker, a way to dig beneath the polished exterior of the company he now owned? As the first day unfolded, the staff would learn the hard way just how wrong they were about the quiet man with the mop. And by the end of it all, they'd wish they'd never underestimated him. But that story, well, that's just getting started. James Carter entered the lobby of Greenstone Enterprises, pushing the janitor's cart with practiced ease. The sound of the squeaky wheels echoed off the marble floors, breaking the otherwise silent, polished atmosphere. As he moved through the building, he took in the grandeur, the shiny glass walls, the expensive artwork that adorned every corner, the pristine desks where people sat with their noses buried in screens, acting as though they owned the place. They didn't know it yet, but he did. For the first few hours, James kept to himself. He mopped the floors, emptied trash bins, and scrubbed windows while the employees carried on with their work, oblivious to his presence. He heard snippets of conversations, talks about the latest luxury vacations, business deals, and, most notably, the new CEO. He'd already noticed the murmurs of curiosity among the staff. The new owner was a mystery, a billionaire no one had met yet. No one knew what he looked like or how he would change the company. But the one thing that was clear, everyone had an opinion. That guy's probably just another investor trying to make a quick buck. A middle-aged woman in a sharp suit muttered to her colleague as she passed him in the hallway. Her tone was dismissive, as though the idea of a man like James being in charge was laughable. Another young man, tall and well-groomed, chuckled as he walked past. I bet he's one of those CEO types who's too busy to even bother showing up. Probably has someone else do all the dirty work for him. James didn't flinch. He knew what they were thinking. He'd been down this road before. In their eyes, he was just a janitor. To them, he was invisible, a non-person, just a cog in the machine of their high-powered world. But what they didn't realize was how carefully he was watching them. Every interaction, every comment, every mistake they made. It wasn't just the comments that hurt. It was the way they looked at him. The subtle glances, the quick dismissals, the way they never considered him worth speaking to. One woman, who worked in marketing, dropped a stack of files near him as she passed by. She didn't apologize. Instead, she barely glanced in his direction, muttering, "Ugh, can't you be more careful?" James knelt down, gathering the papers, but his patience was thinning. It was the kind of behavior that grated on his nerves, the kind that screamed entitlement. But he remained calm, knowing his time would come. This was all part of the plan. Later, while pushing his cart down a quiet hallway, he overheard a conversation between a group of mid-level managers gathered around a water cooler. "This new CEO is going to be a joke," one of them said, a man in his late 30s with a cocky grin plastered on his face. "I heard he's some rich guy who doesn't know the first thing about running a company. We'll be fine without him." "Yeah," another chimed in. "He'll probably show up one day and expect everyone to bow down to him, like they always do. Not gonna happen. Not with me, anyway." James stood still, his hand gripping the mop tightly. They had no idea. They were playing a dangerous game, one that would cost them dearly if they kept underestimating him. As the day wore on, he couldn't help but notice how little respect they showed for the company. The financial reports they threw around carelessly, the long lunches and endless breaks, the expensive lunches charged to the company's account. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, right under the noses of those who claimed to run the business. But the real humiliation? It wasn't the disrespect or the racism, it was how they treated him like a ghost, an invisible, insignificant piece of furniture in a room full of people who believed they were entitled to everything. At one point, a senior manager walked by looking at James with an air of superiority. "Hey, you?" "Yeah, you," the man said, snapping his fingers. "You missed a spot on the floor. Can't you do anything right? Get it together, or I'll have to report you to someone." The words stung, but James didn't react. He simply nodded, pushing his cart further down the hall. No one knew who he was. No one knew that he was watching. And no one knew that this quiet, seemingly insignificant janitor was the one who would change everything. As the days dragged on, James Carter's role as the invisible janitor gave him unparalleled access to the inner workings of Greenstone Enterprises. It was easy to fade into the background, to watch without suspicion. The staff carried on with their usual routines, thinking him no more than a lowly cleaner. But to James, this was the perfect position. He observed everything, the way the employees interacted, the sloppiness of their work, and the careless attitude some had toward the company they worked for. There were small cracks, like a finely tuned machine starting to fall apart. In the break room, employees would joke about working just enough to get by, while others would leave early with the flimsiest excuses. They didn't seem to care about their responsibilities. Their focus was on their next paycheck, not the long-term success of the business. One day, while wiping down a desk, James overheard two employees talking in hushed voices. They were discussing a luxury dinner they'd recently charged to the company account. A dinner that, according to the receipt James had seen, didn't even meet the standards of a regular business expense. Expensive wine, steaks, and desserts all paid for by Greenstone's funds. The total bill? Over $500. He made a mental note of it, aware that this was just the tip of the iceberg. In another instance, he caught a young assistant swiping a handful of office supplies, pens, notebooks, and high-end headphones into his bag, all while chatting casually with a colleague about how no one would ever notice. It seemed small, petty even, but James knew better. These were the kinds of things that added up over time, draining resources bit by bit. But it wasn't just the small misdeeds that caught his attention. As days passed, James began to piece together a larger, more troubling picture. Late one evening, after the office had mostly cleared out, James was cleaning the finance department when he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. He was wiping down a countertop when he noticed an open folder filled with financial documents. At first glance, they appeared to be routine, but something about them felt off, especially the discrepancies in the numbers. He took a closer look, skimming through the accounts. Payments had been made to several vendors that seemed unusually high, even for the company's standard. James's pulse quickened as he followed the trail. The amounts were staggering, a few hundred here, 1,000 there. But when he dug deeper into the account history, he found a troubling pattern. Funds were being diverted to personal accounts. At first, it was just a few thousand, but then he saw something much more alarming. Someone had been siphoning large sums of money, funneled through fake invoices and forged signatures. It was no small error, it was intentional. Someone in this company was stealing. His stomach churned. The more he uncovered, the more he realized how deep the corruption ran. He couldn't believe it. These people, the ones who dismissed him as nothing more than a janitor, had been lying, stealing, and betraying the company that had paid them well. James stepped back, carefully putting the folder back where he had found it. His mind raced as he tried to process what he discovered. This wasn't just bad management or petty theft. It was fraud. And he couldn't let it go unnoticed. The pieces were starting to fall into place. The staff who had been dismissive of him, the ones who thought they could get away with anything, now they were all suspects. But who was behind the theft? And more importantly, how far would this corruption go? James knew he had to act, but first he needed to gather more evidence. The truth, he realized, was buried deep beneath layers of deception, and he was just getting started. As the days passed, James continued his meticulous work, keeping his head down while quietly gathering evidence. The rhythm of his mop swishing across the floors, the soft clinking of cleaning supplies, these sounds became his constant companions as he moved through the company unnoticed. Every document he found, every conversation he overheard, added more layers to his growing understanding of the corruption festering within Greenstone. But he couldn't act just yet. The moment had to be right. Still, something was changing. His presence, though humble and unassuming, was starting to make the employees uneasy. They had grown used to him, but now they were beginning to notice he was always there, always watching. It wasn't obvious at first. A glance here, a sidelong look there, but it grew. He caught the whispers, the subtle shifts in posture when he entered a room. They were starting to wonder, who was this guy? One afternoon, while cleaning the break room, James overheard a heated conversation between two mid-level managers. They were talking in hushed voices, unaware of his presence just around the corner. "Have you noticed him? The janitor?" one of them whispered. "He's always around. It's like he's everywhere." "I know," the other responded, clearly nervous. "It's freaking me out. Maybe he's some kind of spy or something." James couldn't help but feel a smirk tug at his lips. They were starting to get suspicious, but they still had no idea. It was during another quiet moment, as he swept the floors in a hallway outside of the accounting office, that he had a brief encounter with one of the few employees he had come to trust. Maya, a sharp, hardworking junior accountant. She was one of the few who didn't look at him like he was invisible. She had even exchanged polite smiles with him in passing. As she walked by, she paused, noticing him for the first time in a while. "You've been working late, huh?" she asked, a soft frown on her face. James nodded. "Just keeping things clean," he said, offering his usual humble smile. Maya looked at him carefully, her voice dropping a notch as she lowered her gaze. "You know, I don't think I've seen you get a break. Everyone else is always on their phones or taking extended lunches, but you're always here, cleaning up after us. I don't know how you do it." James was silent for a moment, watching her with careful eyes. "Somebody's got to keep things in order," he replied, his tone just above a whisper. She hesitated before speaking again, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "You ever hear about those strange invoices? They've been popping up lately. The higher-ups don't talk about them much, but some of us have noticed there's something off about them." James felt a chill run down his spine, but his expression remained calm. Maya had no idea how much she had already revealed. "Well," he said softly, his eyes narrowing slightly, "people can be careless, I suppose." She nodded, but there was an uneasy look in her eyes as she moved past him, walking a little faster now. The tension was palpable. James knew they were getting closer to the truth, and now he could feel the eyes of the wrongdoers on him, watching, wondering if he knew too much. And though they were starting to feel the weight of his presence, they still hadn't figured out who he really was. The clock was ticking. The game was about to change, and when he finally revealed himself, it would hit them harder than they could ever imagine. The day James had been waiting for had finally arrived. He'd gathered everything he needed: the evidence, the names, the faces of those who had thought they could get away with theft and humiliation. He had been patient, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And today, that moment had come. It began with a simple email, an invitation for all employees to attend an important announcement in the main conference room. It was a Friday afternoon, and the office buzzed with gossip and speculation. No one knew what was coming, but there was an air of anticipation as the staff filed into the room, chatting nervously. James had kept his identity hidden long enough. Today, he would step into the light and nothing would ever be the same. As the employees took their seats, James entered the room in his usual janitor's attire, pushing his mop bucket in front of him. The room went silent. At first, no one understood why he was there. Was he here to clean up after the meeting? Was he lost? But as he slowly walked toward the front of the room, his face remained calm, almost expressionless. The staff exchanged confused glances, unsure of what was happening. They had no idea that the man they had treated like a ghost, a mere servant, was the one who owned the company they worked for. James stopped at the front of the room, facing them. He reached up and removed his cap, revealing his full, sharp features. The tension in the room hit a boiling point as the realization dawned on everyone. This was no ordinary janitor. This was James Carter, the billionaire who had quietly bought Greenstone Enterprises. There was a collective gasp. Employees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking at one another, others frozen in disbelief. A few faces went pale. They knew immediately what this meant. James's eyes scanned the room, landing on the three employees who had been the most vocal in their humiliation of him. Derek, the senior manager who had dismissed him as a lowly janitor. Olivia, the marketing executive who had made degrading remarks about his presence. And Chad, a junior accountant who had mocked him behind his back. All three were sitting near the back, their smug faces slowly draining of color as they realized who stood before them. "I've spent the last 2 weeks observing," James began, his voice cold but steady. "I've seen everything. The way you've treated me, disrespecting me, dismissing me as nothing more than a janitor, was nothing compared to what I've seen behind the scenes." The room was tense now, every eye fixed on James. He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "You think I didn't notice the way you were spending company money irresponsibly? The way you stole from this company? The fake invoices? The misdirected funds? The lunches charged to the company card that had nothing to do with business?" James's eyes locked onto Derek, Olivia, and Chad. "You three thought you were clever. You thought you could get away with it." The three employees squirmed in their seats, their faces growing hotter with each word. Derek was the first to speak, but his voice trembled. "You can't. This is absurd." "Shut up," James interrupted, his voice cutting through the air. "You've been siphoning off money, diverting funds, falsifying reports, and you thought I wouldn't find out?" The room was eerily quiet now. Derek, Olivia, and Chad were no longer as confident as they had been. They were cornered, exposed. James pulled out a folder from under his arm, slamming it onto the table. "These are the financial records. The ones you thought would never see the light of day. The ones you thought you could bury. It's all here. Every penny you've stolen. Every lie you've told." Olivia's eyes widened in shock, and Chad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. They had no escape now. James turned his gaze back to the room. "You think this company is a playground for your greed? Well, it's not. I'm not here to play games. I'm here to clean up this mess, starting with you three." The tension in the room was suffocating. James's voice grew colder. "Derek, Olivia, Chad, consider this your last day at Greenstone Enterprises." The three employees didn't even try to protest. They stood in stunned silence as the reality of their situation hit them. They had been caught. James turned to the rest of the employees, his gaze shifting to those who had shown respect and integrity. "The rest of you, keep your eyes open. I'm watching." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving the room in stunned silence. The employees were left to process the shock, the humiliation, and the undeniable fact that their new CEO had been right under their noses the entire time. The power had shifted, and James Carter had just revealed who was really in charge. The three corrupt employees stood motionless, their faces pale, as James Carter's words cut through the air like a blade. The room was heavy with the weight of their impending downfall. Derek, Olivia, and Chad had been stripped of their positions in a matter of seconds, their arrogance replaced by disbelief. James didn't wait for them to beg, didn't offer any comfort. The damage had already been done. This wasn't about them. It was about the company they had betrayed. He stood tall, his eyes steady as he addressed them one final time. "I'm not here to play favorites or give second chances to those who've shown no respect for this company or for me," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "You thought you could take what wasn't yours, but integrity, respect, and hard work, those things matter. They will always matter." Derek opened his mouth to protest, but James silenced him with a single glance. "You're all fired, effective immediately." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. The three employees didn't argue. They couldn't. They had no defense. James had caught them red-handed, and now they would pay the price. As they shuffled out of the room, heads hung low, James turned his attention to the rest of the team. He could feel their nervous energy. But it was time for them to understand something important. This wasn't just about punishing the guilty, it was about rewarding those who had remained true. Maya, James called out, his voice firm. Come up here. Maya, the honest junior accountant, looked up in surprise, her eyes wide with uncertainty. She hesitated, then slowly made her way to the front. You've shown integrity, loyalty, and a work ethic that goes beyond what's expected, James said, locking eyes with her. You deserve to be recognized. With that, he extended his hand, offering her a promotion to a higher position in the company. The room fell silent, and for the first time since James had arrived, the employees saw something different in him, a leader who valued honesty and dedication over power games. Next, he called on another employee, a quiet but hard-working project manager named David. David had been the kind of person who worked silently in the background, never seeking attention but always doing his best. He, too, was promoted. As the two employees walked back to their seats, their faces lit with shock and gratitude, James took a moment to reflect. Patience had been his greatest weapon. By staying in the shadows, observing and listening, he had uncovered the truth without anyone suspecting him. And now, real change was on the horizon. The corrupt had been removed, and those who deserved it had been elevated. James didn't need to flaunt his power. He had already shown that true strength came from quiet, deliberate action. He had cleaned up the company, restored its integrity, and made sure everyone knew respect and loyalty would always be valued above all else. And as he stood there looking over the room, he knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. James Carter's journey had been one of quiet patience and calculated strength. He had watched from the shadows, allowing the truth to unfold on its own terms. His revenge wasn't loud or brash. It was precise, measured, and deeply effective. He cleaned up the company, not with force, but with the power of observation and integrity. Through humility and patience, he transformed not only Greenstone Enterprises, but the very culture within. The lesson? Never underestimate the power of quiet strength. If you want to hear more stories of transformation and suspense, don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next.